in Jesus' parables. Okay.
Before the heat of the day.
Yes. Okay. All right, so let's start here with the development of history. No, let's not do that. Development of history in the history of the eras of the providence of restoration. So, history is God's history, and God is behind history, and it's also the history of a war between God and Satan. That's what history has been since the time of the fall of Adam and Eve. God has used every opportunity to move people and humanity toward salvation and toward the kingdom of God on earth and in heaven. And history has used, and Satan has used every opportunity to block that kind of progress. And so modern history is exactly the same. It's also a part of that. Although we have better records of a modern history, of course, and so we can see it more clearly. And in the past, we didn't have better records. Often it was oral history, and we don't even have some of the original manuscripts, for example, even the original manuscripts of the Gospels, for example. We actually don't have those, but we actually have fragments of copies, and we put those fragments together to create the New Testament and so forth. So it's really a very fragmented sources that we have for the past, but more recently it is much more clear. Of course, now that we have the internet, it's even clearer than that. So anyway, we look at the development of history from the perspective of the providence of restoration, because history is the record of the providence of restoration. History is the record of God's effort to bring Satan to natural subjugation and to establish God's kingdom on the earth. So the kingdom of heaven on earth, what is that like? It's a world similar to a single completed human being, all parts working in harmony towards one goal. Yeah? The ideal of creation world, the world similar to a single completed person. But the fallen world is a world resembling a single fallen person, each part working in conflict with the other. Right hand wants to do one thing, the left hand wants to do another thing, and there's not working together. Accordingly, by observing the life practices of a single fallen person, we can understand the overall contents of human history. Fallen human beings are the source of both good and evil, because we have mind and we have body. But in our mind, we have evil thoughts. We have evil thoughts and good thoughts. We have an evil mind and an original mind. The two minds are always fighting and in conflict within the one body, as Paul said. And even in our original minds, even in our own minds, we know that some things, sometimes, I know I shouldn't eat that cookie, but we go there, I know I shouldn't click on that link, but we still go there sometimes. So we know we shouldn't do things, but we still do them. So we have this both good and evil. Like Paul says, we have two laws within us. Hasn't changed since the time of Paul and today. And are always fighting and in conflict with one body. So individual right between spirit and flesh, couples, family, nation, global contact. So the evil mind produces evil deeds through the body, and the good mind produces good deeds through the body. So the human history is the struggle between good and evil, right? Separation of good and evil, and directed toward the purpose of goodness. The communists will say that human history is the struggle toward a communist world. A centralized communist world, but that's not the case, is it? It's actually the struggle between good and evil and towards God's kingdom. The original mind is always at work. Original mind is that part of us that God, because God is our creator, He has His little thing in there called the original mind, even in the most evil person. May not seem like it, and He may cover it up pretty well, but it's there. Even in fallen human beings, it directs itself toward the purpose of goodness in accordance with God's providence and restoration. Accordingly, even if war or conflict results in a momentary victory for evil, history continues to eventually change toward the providential course directed towards the purpose of goodness. So eventually, God's going to win. Satan knows this. So what's he doing? Yeah, he just wants to drag it out as much as possible. All right, and it's our fault, actually. It's our responsibility, as we've seen. Human beings had opportunity after opportunity, all the way. So if people had acted in a righteous manner, not thinking of themselves, but thinking righteously, not thinking of their own position or power, but thinking righteously, then things would have been very, very different. And each stage along the way. Fallen human beings have a blood relationship with Satan. Yes, we have that lineage. And that began with Eve and then Adam. Because human beings fell and formed a blood relationship with Satan, Satan took the lead to establish an unprincipled world, centering on fallen human beings before God could establish his ideal. Let me make that a little bit bigger. The unprincipled world that Satan established is similar in form to the principled world God intended to establish, because Satan knows the principle. Satan knows God's ideal, because he was there. He was there when God was building the world. So he knows it, but he wants the same kind of form, external form, but centering on himself. Accordingly, in the course of the providence of restoration, that which is false appears before that which is true in the form and shape of that which is true. This is why the Bible prophesies that before Christ returns, an Antichrist would appear. In the last days, at the end of human history, the world of communism emerged in accordance with this principle. So, in the fallen human beings are now in ignorance, okay, spiritual, physical ignorance. The mind, spiritual ignorance, and body, physical or flesh ignorance. So, ignorant of God and ignorant of the good and evil, difference between good and evil in human beings. And in the physical ignorance, we're ignorant now of the basis of matter, laws of the universe. So that's why then people were living in caves and couldn't figure out how to build a house for many years. And I don't think it should have taken that long. Even in the generation of Adam, I suspect it could have been figured out. But anyway, religion has been the pursuit of the spiritual knowledge and to resolve spiritual ignorance. And this is in the subject-partner position. And the science has been in the position of object-partner, and it has been pursuing that physical knowledge of knowledge about the physical universe. Politics are the interaction here between that, and so science, also part of science, is the economy. So science and religion need to be unified because they are both pursuing the same purpose. That is to overcome the ignorance that was caused by the human fall, and it's all one. It's all part of God's creation, all part of God's cosmos. It's just the different aspects. Because right now spirit and flesh are divided, so also religion and science many times appear to be in conflict with each other. But Father never saw it that way. I read you the part of the speech, the founder's address that Father gave to the first International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences. And these ICAS conferences were held annually for, I guess, more than 20 years. Unfortunately, they're not being held now. Well, if they were held, they would be held in a strange way, so maybe it's better that they take a break for now. So anyway, the development of history in the era of the providence of restoration, okay? So, here, the primitive society, collective society, mutual exchange centering on Satan, and here coexistence, co-prosperity, and common ethics society. This would be the coexistence, co-prosperity, and common ethics is what. That's the very sort of off-center English. Well, it's the best you can do in English. 공정, 공영, 공의 사회, or anyway, a society centered on God. Coexistence and co-prosperity, I suppose, is good, but 공의 as common ethics, I think, is and various translations have been attempted of that phrase, but common ethics, maybe, okay. I can kind of see the reason. So anyway, this was what was attempted there. And then clan society, feudalistic society, monarchic society, the Egyptian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Hittite Empire, and so forth. And then this is the evil in this northern kingdom of Israel, and democratic type society facilitating the formation of the Messiah's kingdom. And here then coexistence, co-prosperity, and common ethic society, good clan society centering on Abraham, Israelite clan society, Jacob, with his 12 sons and 70 elders, 70 kinsmen, the good feudalistic society centering on the judges, and good monarchy, single unified kingdom centering on King Saul, and the southern kingdom of Judah. This is the northern kingdom of Judah. And then the democratic form society. Okay, well, let's not go too deeply into that one. Development of history in the era of a prolongation of restoration. So this would be in the last 2,000 years. So Israel, failure both spirit and in flesh. So the Israelite people caused Jesus to be murdered. In other words, they allowed him to be turned over to the Romans to be crucified. And Roman foundation prepared for the Messianic kingdom was lost, because originally Rome was to be like the United States today. It was supposed to be a foundation for the Messianic kingdom. Then the chosen people of Israel and Judaism fall under Satan's control and dominion, and God's providence shifts toward the West and Western Europe as a result. Then Rome, or spiritual Christianity, the formation of Christian tribal society, and the formation of Christian feudal society. Tribal meaning that there were churches in many places. Aside from the 5 that we talked about earlier, there were also churches in Crete, and where else did Paul go? Of course, in Corinth and in Ephesus and other places like that. Thessalonica, places around the Asia Minor and around the Greek peninsula and so forth. So the Christian tribal society, and then gradually these were sort of consolidated into 5 major centers that we talked about before. Rome was one of them, Constantinople was another, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. These were major Christian centers. And Christian monarchic society then with the Pope, and then Pope in Rome, and then Christian democracy following the Reformation. Reformation, the idea, one of the big principles of the Reformation was that everyone should be able to read the Bible directly. Prior to that, lay people, common believers, had to rely on their priest or the Pope to interpret the Bible for them or tell them what was in the Bible. The Bible was only written in languages that the common people could not understand, in Latin. And also all the church services were conducted in Latin, which was a language that the elite of Europe understood and studied, but common people did not. So Martin Luther and other reformers came along and came along with this idea that each person should be able to approach God directly. So in that case, it was a kind of Christian democracy. So in order to establish the Messianic kingdom, in order to break the dictatorship of popes who had fallen away from following the will of God. The Catholic Church was pretty corrupt. Even of course, the famous thing about the indulgences, to raise money for the St. Peter's Basilica that you see in Rome today, they were selling what they call indulgences. So if you bought these indulgences, then you or your ancestors would not have to suffer so much in the spirit world. And of course, when Chongpyong is still demanding very high payment for spiritual liberation of ancestors, that comparison was pretty obvious. So that's why today, when the king does a liberation and blessing of ancestors, he says, you set the offering, out of your sincere heart, what you think is the appropriate offering for you to make. And if the number is 0, then okay, if that is your sincere heart, you cannot afford anything more or whatever the reason. If the number is 0, then that's fine. So And then freedom of faith, translation of the scriptures. So after that, before then, it was punishable by death to translate the Bible into any language. Yeah, people were killed, burned at the stake, actually, killed in very gruesome ways for this crime of translating the Bible. But after the religious Reformation, then this became the English Bible was published, and other languages of Bible were published. So people could go to God directly. They could see what was in the Bible directly. And that, was only in the last 400 or 500 years that became possible. And so people could meet Christ freely. So then then England then with the spiritual Christianity, sort of the center of the providence and the culture and civilizations, or moved to England. England, had the British Empire, and became the dominant power in the world. But there was a struggle between Protestant and Catholic within Britain. And then there was the Industrial Revolution and the policies of colonialism and propagation of Christianity and liberation of colonies as they went on. But the Industrial Revolution really broke down the medieval and the feudal society, and also really began to break down the extended family, right? Because people now were moving to urban areas, seeking jobs, and it became much more difficult to maintain the kind of families that had been developed previously. And colonialism, colonialism had many negative points, but what God was able to do through colonialism was that Christianity was spread throughout the world, and to Asia, of course, but also to Africa and to every corner of the earth. And so the propagation of Christianity went on after the world. And after World War II, then we see the liberation of the colonies, the independence of the colonies taking place. And in America, spiritual Christianity Rome is formation, England is growth, and the U.S. is completion. The Puritans coming to America, and then establishing Christianity. Father always talked about how the Puritans built their churches first, and then the school, and then their own homes. And so Father was very impressed with that kind of priority, and also the fact that on the way over, there was seed that they were going to plant in the New World. And sometimes some people were actually dying of hunger on the boat on the way over. But even people dying of hunger did not and could not eat any of that seed, because that was not for consumption on the trip. That was for planting in the New World once they got here. And some people sacrificed their lives rather than eat that seed, which would be planted in the New World. So Father said that America needs to go back to that kind of tradition, putting God first, putting the churches, building the churches first in education, and then their own homes, and so like that. So to democratic society, and first economic, and a free market, imperialism, but then eventually developing free market capitalism on God's side. And then here, Satan's side, developing socialism, and then communism in the 19th century. God's side going from socialism to coexistence, co-prosperity, universal values. But God's socialism is a situation of living for the sake of others, and of a Shimjong culture. In other words, having the irrepressible impulse to give love to an object partner, whereas Satan's socialism is to concentrate the means of production in the hands of, they say the state, but actually in the hands of the elite, the few who are the elite. In North Korea, there is an elite that can shop in certain stores. In Soviet Union, there was a whole department store that was only open to senior members of the Communist Party and some foreign visitors, things like this. So the elite have a different existence from the common people. People like Xi Jinping the majority of the Chinese people today still live in abject poverty. It is only a portion, about a quarter of the population that lives along the East Coast that is allowed to have a certain standard of living. And yes, some people have become very rich because of their contacts in the Communist Party. The elite live a very, very affluent life, while the majority, and I would say 3/4 of the population, live in abject poverty. So that is the kind of society that Satan produces, whereas God's side creates universal values. So the equality of opportunity in the society on God's side. Just want to make the point that think of the situation at the end of World War II, okay? The United States was the only country with the nuclear weapon. The United States was the only country that had not been scathed by World War II. There was no fighting during the World War II on U.S. territory, except for, for Hawaii, and some of the few of the Aleutian Islands. But the United States won the war without any kind of invasion from Germany or Japan onto the territory. So, and the United States had made a lot of money selling weapons and other supplies to England and to France and to also to Russia. So the United States was in a very special position then. And this was a Christian country, Judeo-Christian country. And Father points this out and said, if Christianity had united with him at the end of World War II, Cheongguk would have come in 7 years, between 1945 and 1952. But of course, that didn't happen, and we may get into some of the reasons that it didn't. But Christianity in Korea didn't unite with Father. Father had, if they had united, Father had connections to the American military there, and he could have been involved in the creation of the United Nations, for example. And one thing he said about the United Nations is that it never should have included the Soviet Union in the first place. It only should have been organized with Christian countries. So, the 5 countries that got together to form the core of the United Nations were the victor countries. That was the United States, England, and France, Soviet Union, and China, but not Beijing, China, okay, because the Chinese Communist Party did not take over control of Beijing until 1949. So this was Chiang Kai-shek's China. And Chiang Kai-shek is in a larger sense that he was within the cultural sphere of a Christianity. And Father also had connections with him. So he had the connections to do this between 45 and 52. But everything fell apart. And so, we'll get into that later. But the United States, just to point out that at the end of World War II, the United States was in a very special position that will likely never come again, at least not before Cheongguk is actually established. And so it was really a tremendous opportunity, again, that was squandered, a tremendous opportunity for God and people on God's side that was squandered then by the failure of certain key people to connect Father to the people that he needed to be connected to. Anyway, so here we are as in 2021. Anyway, so let's go. Society of the ideal of creation, Cheongguk. So Godism, coexistence, prosperity, and now we're calling it common righteousness. A while ago we called it something else, right? What was it a while ago? Common ethics, okay. And because no one can think of a good translation, it keeps changing. Well, let's try this one. Well, let's try this one. Well, let's try this one. In Korean, it's all the same word. But when we do it this way in English, it makes it sound as though it's different. But at least here they put it in Korean, Kongseng. Kongseng means to live together, all right? And Kongyong means to prosper together. And then Kong-ui, so that's the difficult one. Ui means righteousness, that's true. Yep, it means righteousness. Kong can mean public or common, yes, okay. But what? What does that mean? So anyway, so this is why we need to learn it in Korean and then study Father's words to see how he uses that phrase in various contexts. And then through prayer and meditation, we can come to some kind of a spiritual understanding of what he means by Kong Ui. All right, so coexistence means abundant production as required, fair and just distribution, reasonable and rational consumption. So, and so economic community. So, this part of the OSDP now gets into more and more I think the filter, shall we say, of revenues understanding. And so it's we're getting a little bit into an area a little bit weaker now, because obviously the supply of the law of supply and demand is the best way to distribute scarce resources. And this is just, there's no question about this. Even in a communist society, the supply of law and demand is still active. People will sometimes, line up for milk or something like that. But here also, that's because there's demand there, right? Demand. And so instead of spending more money on something, on a higher price for something, they're spending more time on something, for milk, for example. So again, even in a communist society, the law of supply and demand is still very active. This is not something that human beings created. It just is. It just is. It's a law of nature, the law of supply and demand. So as demand goes up, and the supply remains constant, then the price will rise to the point where people will stop buying it, and then price will then start to come down. Or if the supply goes up and price remains constant, the supply goes up and the demand remains constant, then price will go down. And housing, right? This is the way it works in housing. If there are a lot of houses on the market, what happens to price? Unless demand also goes up, the prices are going to come down. Not because anybody made it come down, but that's just the way it is. Right? People making individual decisions on whether they want to buy or not, whether they're willing to pay a certain price or not. So the fair and just distribution has to be the law of supply and demand. That's just the best way. We have governments trying to set prices, and not just communist governments. In the 1970s, President Nixon tried fixing prices. Don't raise prices. That only distorts the market, and that only causes more problems later on. And so in the early 1980s, it got so bad, right, so that the Federal Reserve decided to raise the interest rates to something more than 10 or 12%. And it was a very painful experience then. But that's what happens when government intervenes. And the Federal Reserve itself, by the way, is a form of central planning. So actually, it'd be better if we didn't have a central bank. And in Cheongguk, the central bank is outlawed. There is no central bank in Cheongguk. Today, there are countries without a central bank. Yeah, not every country has a central bank. Anyway, so abundant production as required. Well, who decides what's required? The consumer, the demand, right? Demand. And so soybean farmers, for example, try to project demand. And of course, they are going to be harvesting some months from now, and so they're trying to predict what the demand is going to be some months from now. Fair and just distribution, reasonable and rational consumption. Well, again, if you have the law of supply and demand, you have reasonable and rational consumption. So then co-prosperity, overcoming egotistical selfishness. Okay, if we have a Shimjong culture, yes. If people are living for the sake of others, yes, and guaranteed human rights and opportunity, okay, and then shared authority and reputation. I don't even know what that means. So this is a political community and governance, okay? And common values. Here we had up here was common righteousness, or on the same slide is now common values. Okay, absolute standard, absolute sex, ethical and moral society, world of culture of Shimjung. Okay? Yeah, let's. We need to decide. I guess common righteousness is the most literal translation. So, what is exposition translated as? Common. Yeah, but let's say righteousness. Let's make it all righteousness. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and in 444 as well. Okay, and then world of culture of Shimjung, ethical community. But this kind of society takes a long time, so we need a framework that will encourage goodness and discourage, disincentivize evil. And so that is what the Cheongguk Constitution is about, the Constitution of the United States of Cheongguk. Because in the United States, in the Constitution, it says that the government cannot outlaw hallucinogenic substances. So in the United States of Cheongguk, the government cannot outlaw marijuana or LSD or any other drug. But also, there is no welfare. And also, the family is strengthened so that this kind of education can take place in the family. And also, there's no welfare so that the people who do these kinds of things and, for example, cannot get a job because of their drug habit, then cannot collect money from the government. So they bear the consequences of their bad decisions. And then others will see that happening and they will learn from those bad decisions and say, okay, well, maybe I better not get into drugs. So this is how the Constitution works for Cheongguk that the king has declared. And also education, the government does not get involved in education. Federal government not involved in education. So the local or families get involved or do the education. Of course, families can come together and create schools, whether it's like the charter schools that we have now or private schools that we have now. Those are possible, sure, but no government schools. So the government is not able to teach its own propaganda, right? And also healthcare, no government healthcare. Healthcare also has to be done in the private sector, which means that it will most likely be done on the supply and demand principles. You can have a nonprofit organizations, sure, doing healthcare. That's fine too if they want to do that. But the government will not get involved in healthcare. No Medicare or Medicaid, or no Medicare and Medicaid, and no Social Security, no welfare, okay, no food stamps. People who need those safety nets will have to rely on their families or on their communities. And so that will encourage them to develop stronger ties within their family and within their communities. Today's welfare system has done a lot towards destroying the family, especially when the government says, well, we're going to give priority to single women with children. Well, what am I going to do? I've got a husband. Well, I guess I better get rid of my husband in order to get welfare. So it incentivizes divorce. It incentivizes the destruction of the family. Incentivizes families that have no fathers. And especially if you have sons growing up in families with no fathers, what's going to happen to them? Right? What's going to happen to them? Even daughters. And you have mothers living with boyfriends. And then, as the king said, the chance of a child being abused is greatest when you have a mother living with her boyfriend. That's the most dangerous sort of a living situation. But today the situation has deteriorated so much that even the definition of family is being destroyed. So anyway, I don't want to get too much into that. Listen to the King's report. So anyway, this is what we're trying to get away from now, and so that's why the Cheongguk Constitution is the way it is. Okay? Any questions there before we go to the period of preparation for the second coming of Christ? All right, then let's move forward. So, the period of preparation for the second coming of Christ from 1517 to 1918, 400 years. And it's divided into three periods. the period of the Reformation from 1570 to 1648, and that's to the Treaty of Westphalia, and the period of religious and ideological conflicts to 1789, and the period of maturing of politics, economy, and ideology from 1789 until 1918. Okay? So let's look at the period then of the Reformation overview. Period of 130 years starting in 1517. I mean, history is always, it's not like you wake up one day and, okay, now we're in a new period. These dates are assigned, even in the history that is taught in the textbooks, it's never as cut and dry, as it sometimes is made to seem, the end of one era and the beginning of another era. But Martin Luther's nailing his 95 Theses to the church door was certainly something that symbolized what was going on at the time. And it was a gradual change. It didn't suddenly happen on that day, but it was a gradual change. But that event pretty much encapsulated and symbolized what was happening. So that's why we can use the word, the date of 1517. So he raised the banner of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and until the Catholic Wars were settled by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So this is we can say that these two events from Luther, I think it was in October, wasn't it, 1517, putting those list of questions up on the door and then sort of challenging the authority of the church till the end of the religious wars by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So this is the period of this period of Reformation. And the character of the period was that it was shaped by the Renaissance and by the Reformation, both products of medieval feudal society. And reasons for the emergence of the Reformation and the Renaissance, the medieval feudalism was breaking down, and the Roman Church was becoming secularized. So there's a rebellion against the repression of the original human nature. So people were no longer being tied to the manors, as they called them, or the fiefs, to the lords. In the previous time, especially previously, even to travel, you had to have the written permission of your lord in order to travel. And you were living on a manor, and the lord in the castle would take a certain amount of your crop or whatever you produced, and in return, he was supposed to provide protection. But this was breaking down. That kind of system was breaking down, and people were rebelling against the original human nature, both in terms of the breakdown of feudalism and in the breakdown of the Catholic Church. And the desires of the human nature, of the original human nature externally, to movement for the revival of Hellenism and Renaissance, and the movement for the revival of Hebraism in terms of the Reformation. So people began to study more the philosophies of Aristotle, Plato and Aristotle, and reading more the classical novels of ancient Greece and so forth. And there was also the sculptures and sculptures, for example. There's also looking back to Greek and Hellenic art and reviving that. So, and also for internally movement for the revival of Hebraism, of Reformation. So going to a period where people could approach the Word of God individually, and also not have to go through your priest in order to get to God, but to go directly. The Renaissance began in the 14th century Italy, the center of study of the classical Hellenic thought, and movement to revive the classical culture of Greece and Rome, a movement that transformed the medieval way of life. And aside from culture, it became a movement that revolutionized all aspects of society, including politics, economic life, and religion. The Renaissance became the external driving force that formed modern society. But the Renaissance was a revival of a Hellenic thought, which was very much of a Cain type, right? Because they had pagan gods, and they worshipped the beauty of the human body. So, for example, ancient Greece, the Olympics were held where all the athletes were totally naked, because they thought the human body was beautiful, especially the bodies of athletes were very beautiful. And things like homosexuality were common practice in Greece and in Rome, as the king has said. The baths that they had, and also the teachers and students would often be involved in homosexual relationships. So that was the sort of the development of the Cain-type culture thought now during this 400 years. The Reformation, on the other hand, the cause of the Reformation found in secularization and corruption of the papacy and priesthood. And also I was watching a series of videos about the Black Death, and one of the main points that they made there was that without the Black Death, the Reformation may not have come about. Because the Black Death really destroyed the credibility of the Catholic Church. People were no longer believing that the Catholic Church would bring them physical salvation from this type of death, and rebelling against the formality and ritualism of the Church, and stimulated by the Renaissance, and it germinated as a movement to restore the spirit of early Christianity. This is one of the things that many of the reformers, Luther and other reformers, wanted to do, to restore the spirit of the early Christianity. In 1517, opposition arose to the selling of indulgences by Pope Leo X, and I told you about that. You could buy these indulgences which would let your ancestors out of purgatory more quickly and rise to a higher level of spirit world. The opposition, centered on Martin Luther, ignited the Protestant Reformation. And, you know, there were, for example, the church over here down the road, the Moravian church. They say, oh, you know, we were reformers before Luther, which is true, but they were small. So they kind of, technically they're right, yes, they were number one, but Luther was the big one, okay? Luther was the big one, yeah. What they say is not wrong. International wars between the Catholics and Protestants continued for some 100 years. Because at that time, you know, if your king was Catholic, then you had to be Catholic. And if the next king was Protestant, then you had to be Protestant. And every time, you know, a king would change, then there was a lot of killing. And also between, you know, well, for example, France was continually allied with the Pope, and so the Huguenots, for example, were a Protestant community in France, and massacred. There were genocides occurring, just mass murders occurring over the issue of, are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic? Do you pledge allegiance to the Pope? If not, we're going to kill you. Do you pledge allegiance to the Pope? In that case, you're okay. So depending on which side you were on, depending on who your king was, who your prince was, people would have to either kill each other or not. So this kind of wars in Europe went on for about 100 years, eventually culminating in the 30 Years' War fought on German soil. In 1648, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Westphalia, which brought the 30 Years' War to a conclusion. So the overview of this period of religious and ideological conflict. This is the time of the Reformation, the Renaissance and the Reformation. Now, the next period within the 400 years is this 140 years of religious and ideological conflict. This was 140 years starting with the success of the Protestant movement at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So at that treaty, then basically Protestants could be recognized as a thing. They were no longer a cult, basically. Okay, they're no longer a cult. To put it in modern terms, until then they were a cult that had to be wiped out. And ending with the French Revolution in 1789, the Reformation and Renaissance. And then again, you know, these are dates that symbolize and encapsulate something that was happening on a gradual basis. So the Reformation and the Renaissance together ushered in freedom for the internal and external aspects of the original nature of human beings. Medieval societies encountered ideological disputes and division arising from their freedom and faith and thought. There was a theological struggle, doctrinal division, and philosophical conflict. God unfolded his providence of restoration through a history of dividing Abel-type and Cain-type groups and peoples. In the last days of human history, the world itself will be divided into an Abel-type world and a Cain-type world. So looking at this, so the Cain-type view of life, humanism. So humanism meaning that the human being is the most important. So it is, this is contrasting now with Godism or theism, you might say, saying that God is most important. So Humanism, well, anyway, let's get into it. The external pursuit of original human nature, or external pursuit, right, gave rise to a movement to revive Hellenistic thought, which in turn gave birth to humanism. Medieval society came to judge all aspects of human life through either reason, rationalism, such as in Descartes, or empirical observation, empiricism, such as Francis Bacon. These two trends gave birth to a view of life which blocked human beings from pursuing a relationship with God through their internal inclinations, and instead opened up the path for them to gravitate towards Satan by actively pursuing their external inclinations. And this is what the sort of the decline in the credibility of the Catholic Church had done. People began to say, okay, well, let's explain everything without God, because until or through the Reformation, then the Catholic Church had a pretty strong hold on society, and everyone was pretty much required to believe in God, forced to really believe in God. As a result, both the perspective on nature and human beings came to be increasingly separated from God. The Cain-type view of life led medieval people in a direction that separated them from or made them independent of God, or trying to be independent of God, or thinking that they're independent of God, okay? And the practice of faith. Figures who historically represented the Cain-type view of life, Strauss, Feuerbach, Hegel, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong. So these are people like that. And I would also add, well, let's see, we could add a bunch of others too, but the Cain-type view of life fused together the atheism and materialism which emerged following the Renaissance and developed through the Enlightenment and finally matured into Marx, the cornerstone of the communist world of today. So this was the Cain-type worldview that started developing then from the 16th century and into the 17th and then 18th and 19th centuries. So in contrast to that, we have the Abel-type view of life, and they have Godism already here, but Godism is different. Let's check that. Put a check mark there, will you please, Carrie? I think maybe they meant to say theism. Anyway, huh?
Why
Yes.
is Hegel on the Cain type if he believed in God? Wasn't his theory twisted later?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry for Hegel, but yeah, it was probably was, yes, but I don't think he developed something that could be used by Marx. So this is not. I don't think. Yeah, but this may not be written in stone. Hegel may be able to get himself out of this. I don't know, but let's talk to someone who has studied Hegel a lot. Okay. I don't know what Hegel's religious views were. So the original human nature of medieval people not only drove them to focus on external aspects, but eventually led them to include more internal aspects as well. As their original human nature led them to pursue these internal values, a movement to revive Hebraism arose. This movement culminated in the Protestant Reformation. The Abel-type view of life stimulated modern man to seek God in a deeper and more profound way. And figures who historically represented the Abel-type view of life were Immanuel Kant and Fichte and Schelling. So we have the communist, Cain-type world of communism and the Abel-type world of, for lack of a better word, democracy. So in order that human beings could form these two worlds and two different views of life, underpinning them had, two different views of life that underpinned them had to be established. So humanity's view of life, one of the two would prevail. Okay? One of the two. There was a competition between the increasingly secular humanistic view and the increasingly spiritual, God-centered, you might say, God-centered or theistic view. So then the final number 3 of the 3 periods within the 400 years, and this is a period that lasted for 130 years, starting from the time of the French Revolution and until the end of the First World War. And this is the maturation of politics, going from medieval feudal society, a monarchic society, democratic society, and then breaking off into Abel-type democracy and Cain-type democracy. And French Revolution was very much of a Cain type of a democracy, wasn't it? The adherents of atheism and materialism experienced a flourish of awareness that drove them to tear down the remains of the old absolutist system of society. And then Abel type England and USA, when fervent Christians fought with absolutist forces in pursuit of freedom to practice their Protestant faith, the victories led, I see a misspelling there. It should be L-E-D, not T. Do you see that, Carrie? Here, led to the birth of Abel-type democracy. Oh, you can't see my cursor. Okay. Yeah, led to the birth of Abel-type. Yeah, I've got good, like I said, I've got good glasses. Anybody wants a referral to an optometrist? And then to the liberal democracy. So the French Revolution and the revolutions in England and USA were very different, weren't they? Especially the American Revolution, where Washington and Jefferson and others insisted that they had rights that had been given to them by God, and the King of England and no one else could deny these rights or could say that we didn't have these rights, and that a constitution was established not to give rights to people, but to facilitate the exercise of those rights. You know, I think I mentioned before that when I speak to Japanese people, I ask them, do you have a Second Amendment right in Japan? And they say no. And I tell them, you're wrong. You do. God has given you a Second Amendment right to possess guns, just that your constitution, your laws don't allow the exercise of that right. You have it, you just can't exercise it. So God didn't give only Americans this right. He gave it to everybody, just that the American Constitution allows for its exercise. Yeah. And that's an important difference. Yeah. So people in those countries need to work, you know, and I say, you know, within the law, work to change your laws. I don't want anyone to think that I'm fomenting revolution in Japan. But, yeah, okay. Anyway, so the French Revolution, you know, as Cook Jinning points out, you have situations, and the French Revolution was class against class, upper class versus lower class, and the upper class was overthrown, and so they were, you know, all hundreds of thousands were their heads were cut off. Whereas with the American Revolution, the society was split from top to bottom. The elite also split, and the result was that in the French Revolution, you had another dictatorship. You had Robespierre with his reign of terror, and then eventually, you know, you had Napoleon and his sort of descendants trying to reestablish the monarchy. Trying to reestablish a tyranny there. But whereas in the United States you had a completely different form of government, sort of democratic form of government, where George Washington refused to take a third term in office, not because it was in the Constitution back then, it wasn't. That amendment didn't come along until after FDR. FDR took 4 terms, and then, you know, the Republicans said, okay, that's enough. We don't want this happening again. So they created an actual amendment to the Constitution, which is probably not necessary. If anybody had been able to have another third term, you know, who it would have been? Obama. No, Ronald Reagan. Well, maybe Obama would. Reagan could have had a third term if it had not been for that amendment. So the Republicans made that amendment, and it hurt them, yes. And that's often the way it happens. All right, and if Reagan had had a third term, maybe we never would have had a first term of Obama, I don't know. So anyway, too much, watch the King's Report. Okay. All right, so here, all right, so this is you know, something that apparently Reverend Yu has cleared this with Father, but well, let's work through this. Yes, okay, the society is going to look like the completed human being. And so, no, let's not do this, come on. This is Um, 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 okay. So the structure of the ideal society is similar to the structure of the human body. And the human body has a brain and a spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, and entire body. And I'm sure we can figure out how this will, in fact, be the case. The society certainly will run harmoniously and smoothly, like the human body does, in a healthy human body. But certainly, the idea of the political party being equal to the brain is weak. Thank you. Did someone say weak? Unique? No, I heard weak. I think that was God talking to me. It's and the stomach, the legislature being the stomach, the heart being the executive, and the lung being the judiciary. Well, separation of powers is certainly there, and Father talked actually about the 5 branches of government, the 3 that we know of: the executive, legislative, and judiciary, plus financial and media. And some people will look at the Chunuk Constitution and say, well, how come the Chunuk Constitution doesn't have 5 branches of government? But it does have provisions for the financial and the media, and it doesn't have to be in the Constitution for it to actually exist. Banks certainly already act as the financial system already acts as another branch of government. And the media, look at the mainstream media today. They definitely today are acting as another branch of government. And they consider themselves part of government. CNN, is the organ medium of the Democrat Party and of the current administration. Carrie, I think you want to ask a question.
Yeah, so Father said that government should have a branch of finances and a branch of media?
Yes. There'll be 5 branches instead of 3, yes.
I thought I've heard that the Chinese Constitution it needed to have 5 branches because 3 were not enough to prevent what has happened to our country now. And I thought the 2 additional ones were the role of the Inspector General, who has, a separate power to investigate government, and then also the role of the king, though while he is part of the judicial branch, he still has a unique role. I thought that those were the 2 additions to the Constitution that made it stronger.
Father said that the financial and media would be the 2 additional branches of government.
Okay, but then but they're not in the Chingogo Constitution.
They are.
Okay, can you explain?
Well, we'll have another class on the Constitution. Let's not get into that now. Yeah.
But just that without.
But I just explained that it doesn't have to be in the Constitution for them to exist. Already, the media is a branch of government. Already, the banks and the financial system are a branch of government today. The Federal Reserve is a branch of government.
But we don't want that in the.
We don't want that, no.
But Father said they should be.
I didn't say they would be like they are today. No.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. But already, I'm just saying that already, even though the financial and media are not part of the U.S. Constitution, they de facto are branches of government. And so also in Chonu, there will be these aspects there. But anyway, let's not talk about the Constitution now, okay?
Just in a different manner, right? In a different manner.
Well, of course in a different manner. It's a different kingdom, okay? So the entire body, a vertical relationship with the brain, and horizontal relationships and members of society, vertical relationship with God, and they'll also have horizontal relationships with each other. The process of restoration, sole king with a political party with 3 powers. I would take out political party there. There's no need to have political parties. Political parties will arise naturally, as they did in the United States. Political parties are not in the U.S. Constitution. They just, but like-minded people are going to gather together, and they're going to strategize together. So the king and the church, he keeps on trying to bring in a political party, doesn't he? And so anyway, so the ideal society restored centering on God's word, and ideal society realized according to the law of the three stages of development. So the ideal of Chandragupta, the division of the three powers, or the separation of three powers, I think is the correct word to use, separation of five powers: legislature, executive, judiciary, finance, and media. There you go. At the bottom of the slide, okay? Yep. But you know, the media today, what is the media called today? The fourth estate, right? Or the fifth estate? Is it fourth estate or fifth estate? I can't remember, yeah. All right, so already media is considered part of government. But of course, it's going to be in a different aspect. And the Chandragupta Constitution, which is clear to everyone who has read it carefully, already deals with these issues. In the maturation of economy, the significance of the Industrial Revolution, ideal of creation, a society without sin, and a happy living environment. Right? An Industrial Revolution that began in England arose in order to restore a living environment suitable for an ideal society. And eventually, no? The Industrial Revolution, restoration of external living environment for an ideal society. So, yes, human society has, world society has increased in wealth exponentially during the last, let's say, 300 or so years, right? And we were enjoying external wealth that people in the past never could have dreamed of. And this was all in preparation for the second coming and for the coming of Chandragupta. The internal mission of the providential restoration for spreading the gospel. And the rise of the great powers and division of the colonies. So the Industrial Revolution then markets for surpluses and production, acquisition of industrial raw materials. For these reasons, it was necessary for European powers to pioneer and develop colonies around the world, especially Africa and Asia. And consequently, the great powers rapidly increased in strength as they competed with each other in the scramble for colonies. But in the scramble for colonies, they also spread Christianity. That's true as well. And so that also served God's purpose there. The ideal resembles the structure of a completed human being. And so the realize a world without sin, restoring happy living environment. So here, and we've already actually kind of covered all of this. But anyway, the point is that, and I think you can say that God is the brain because everybody's relating to the brain, and then it's going to be a harmonious functioning of society centering on that. In the period of maturation of ideology, the Cain type and Abel type ideologies, fallen Adam is the womb of good and evil. As we said, fallen Adam must be divided into good and evil. So the division of Adam into elder son Cain, the second son Abel. And then here we have now today that view of life as the Cain type view of life, maturation of ideology or thought from the Renaissance. And then Abel type view of life, and then matures into from the Revolution. So religious and political reformers following the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the product of the Cain-type view of life was the Renaissance, going back to Greek culture and philosophy, and the product of the Abel-type view of life was the Reformation, going back to the early church and to Judeo-Christian ethics and views. And then there was 3 stages of political reformation: the Industrial Revolution and the society of the ideal creation. So the Renaissance then, there was a first Renaissance of literature and second Renaissance of enlightenment, and this is the natural science, and the third Renaissance was of materialism and of the social sciences. And the religion was led by Luther, Calvin, a bunch of others, Zwingli, others, that led the Reformation. And here in a religious revival, there's the Wesley brothers, Fox, Emanuel Swedenborg, and then this led to the unification of religions, new expressions of truth, the new Reformation, who is the true parent today. And in the politics, we see the collapse of medieval feudalism and the whole manor system. And the feudal lord previously had knights and serfs, but that system collapsed. And then also the collapse of absolute monarchy and society fulfilling the ideal of creation then as in the struggle between socialism, communism and socialism, and democracy and capitalism, and Godism, coexistence, co-prosperity, and common, righteousness, okay? And in the first industrial revolution was the steam, and then electricity and gasoline, and then nuclear energy, and as he's added internet. Nuclear energy is kind of falling by the wayside, isn't it? Although it's making maybe a little bit of comeback, but internet certainly was and is a revolution. You know, those of us who remember life before the internet know that it was quite different. Whereas nuclear energy has not really changed the world that much. It's just another, it has changed it some, that's true, electrical, but also medicine in some place, but not nearly as much as it was originally expected, that's for sure. But internet certainly has revolutionized our lives. And, you know, new revolutions are coming. Blockchain may be another revolution. Of course, that may be a kind of a subset of the internet revolution. Another revolution is, what are we calling it? That's blockchain. And telephones. Telephones, well, yeah, that's true, but that's also kind of, that's the microprocessor revolution, microprocessor revolution, yes. Yeah. mRNA, this is what some people are saying will be a revolution, because they're trying to put mRNA now in all vaccines and in all prescription medicines, or all medicines, yeah. We'll see. I don't know about that. Blockchain, certainly. But blockchain may be just another sort of level of the internet revolution. Yes. But yes, blockchain is going to change our life soon, in the next 3 to 5 years, I expect. Yeah. All right. So then, society fulfilling the ideal world of creation. Godism, headwing thought, coexistence, co-prosperity, common righteousness. Yay, there we go again. Good. And then, now we're getting consistent. Abundant production as required. And we already did this. One family under God, one world under God. Okay. And so then now, let's go to the world wars, but let's take a break first, okay? And we'll come back at 2:23.